The Lodge Woman of Cape Town, 1671 to 1795, by Prof. Robert Schell. The women in the slave lodge were in a vastly different situation from the settlers' women slaves. Lodge women, for instance, were not under the direct domestic supervision of any settler or European official. There were almost as many slave women in the lodge as there were men. There were thus possibilities of finding a slave spouse among the lodge inmates. Slave women in the lodge, in contrast to their counterparts owned by settlers, could be effectively married to slave men from as early as 1671. Although this did not entail a wedding solemnized by the Dutch Reformed Church across the way. Actually, a graveyard separated the two buildings. See Figure 1. According to Lord Adriaan van der Riede's more carefully worded instructions, issued in 1685, company slave man and wife were to be left together and to be married in their manner. If a slave couple wished to be wed, they had to ask for permission to be placed on the marriage list. It is important to establish that the official church of the colony never sanctioned or even recorded such marriages. Moreover, the mandated lists of such company slave couples have never been found in the voluminous company books or censuses of company slaves. Significantly, 1 year after Van Riede had left the colony, the local authorities used the Dutch word Avignon to describe these company slave spouses and not the expected word vrouwen, which was used for the settlers' wives. Several scholars of the period have suggested that local officials regarded Van Riede as an aristocratic busybody and all but ignored his heavily touted reforms. Getting to one of these married lists also meant moving to new quarters, since the architecture of the lodge was based on sex: young bachelors on the east wing, spinsters on the west wing, married couples in their own quarters. According to the 1717 report on the new slave lodge, the entire second story of the lodge was to be given over to the best and most respectable paired slaves. This pairing spilled over into the workplace. Even the heaviest labor contingent on the general works in 1693, where one would expect to find high proportion of males who were physically more able of the heavy labor, suggested this pairing. Whether this racial pairing was organized by the company or the slaves themselves is obscure. The company, though, recorded the following: gender and descent status of company slaves, 1693, half-breed, 6-7 MF, so 6 male, 7 female. Full breed, 60 male, 61 female. For each half-breed male slave, there was one half-breed female slave. For each full-breed female slave, there was one full-breed male. Only two extra, quote, overlapping women spoiled the otherwise perfect symmetry of what one might term decent pairing. All half-breed females in the lodge were actually encouraged to marry a man from the Netherlands, who would be expected to pay back the cost of upkeep and education of the slave woman and to free her. The process of settlers formally marrying company half-breeds was common enough for the company to resolve to exact compensation from the bridge groom, who was, after all, acquiring property from the company. Not all bachelor settlers could afford this expense. Consequently, there were several examples of anti-nuptial contracts, whereby the settler or soldier promised that should his slave bride die before him and not have any heirs, he would leave half of the estate of the marriage to the company as compensation for the education and upbringing of the slave bride. As can be seen from the following extract from such a contract, the process of metamorphosis from slavery to freedom and incorporation into the settler family, so dramatic and strange to us, was carefully monitored just as any other humdrum corporate accounting transaction. Andries Olsen, free settler at Stellenbosch, presently intending to marry Sarah van de Kaap, the company's half-breed slave, declares that in the event of his bride's predeceasing him, and in the event of her leaving no legal heirs, that a half of the estate, including land and movables, should be given over to the company at the death house, sterfhuis, before the debts of the estate are settled, to acknowledge and pay off the company's role in bringing up and feeding the above-mentioned bride. According to Van Riede's calculations in 1685, at 22 years of age, this amounted to 150 guilders. 11 European males were often willing to pay. Full-breed women slaves, on the other hand, had to wait much longer for their manumission. Officials obviously presumed that no European would want to marry a full breed, since no provisions were made for such an eventuality, one source even claiming these unions were illegal. Because of the long-term shortage of women at the Cape, half-breed company slave women had a good chance of being married to a European, and this was encouraged officially at the same time as regulations were promulgated against concubinage with full-breed slaves. This seeming contradiction represents a head-on clash between racial attitudes of the time and the demographic reality of the shortage of European women at the Cape. Basing arguments about miscegenation and indirectly race relations at the Cape on the marital trajectories of the company's few half-breed slave women should not be regarded as hard evidence of racial fluidity. In those regions of the colony where European women were more plentiful, the incidence of miscegenation declined. The lodge slave census discourse that the women were under the lodge slave census disclose that the women were under the overall supervision of a male mandoer at the workplace outside the lodge. In the lodge itself, the woman had an equivalent authority figure in the matres, literally a schoolmistress. Her separate lodging, strategically located next to the chamber set aside for the schoolgirls, discloses that her duties exceeded those of the traditional school mom. Therefore, the translation matron seems more appropriate. The two references where matrons were mentioned by name confirm that they enjoyed the same or greater privileges of manumission as did the male half-bred mandoers, but then as mothers they had their own children to free. Significantly, both matrons mentioned were half-breeds. Both were allowed to manumit their children. For example, Armozien van de Kaap, the matron before 1711, who had been manumitted because of good service to the previous governor, Willem Adriaan van der Stel, made a special request to free her daughter, Marie van de Kaap, who still languished in the lodge. The company granted the request, but the resolution stipulated that the slave girl would still have to work for the company for 3 years, after which she would be sold to her mother at the price which Lord Van Riede had laid down in 1685 for all such miscegenated children. In August 1728, Christian van de Kaap, another matron, freed her 13-year-old child, Johanna Barbara van de Kaap, before she thought of her own freedom. Below the matron was the undermistress. Again, the documents confirm the half-breed descent status. Women slaves in these supervisory positions somehow managed to obtain cash as well as their normal prerequisites. For example, the company instantly freed Anna van Dapoer van de Kaap, who had worked for 10 unbroken years as an undermistress in the lodge, when on the 23rd of September, 1727, she represented a male slave, Julie van die Kust, whom the company surgeon, Jan van Schoor, had examined and pronounced upstanding and healthy. She bought Julie out of her own pocket to exchange him for her freedom. This exchange system was the Cape equivalent of the Cuban Yeah, let's see. Coartición, which entitled any slave to purchase freedom at a stipulated price. But unlike the Cuban custom, the Cape practice usually involved an exchange of persons rather than money, and a slave's chances of freedom were statuably greater if the slave could prove European descent. The purchase price of an exchange slave was large by contemporary standards, where such a slave might be worth, say, several horses. Illustrating Ana van der Poor's ordeal, a further 12 years' work as a free woman was needed before she was able to free her children, Jan and Frans, in 1739. Each of the two women slave officers, the last and lowest rung in the lodge's female hierarchy, had an average of 79 work maidens under her supervision, i.e., many more underlings than her fellow male officer, which suggests greater compliance among the lodge women. Like her male counterpart, she received more clothing than her fellows. The woman slave officers, however, also received bolts of linen. Each officer, male and female, received a length of cotton cloth, presumably as part of the overall incentive scheme of the lodge. Elements of the family mode of slave management were infused into the control of the lodge slave woman, but noticeably never among the men, who lived according to strict army-style regulations. The interpolation of the family trope was accomplished through the offices of the internal and external mothers. External mothers were surrogate slave mothers outside the lodge, usually European officials' wives who must have served as ombudspersons. Apologies to all Scandinavians. In 1786, the Political Council appointed and charged 4 external mothers with seeing that the maidens and younger girls of the lodge were well brought up, were familiar with the handicrafts of the fatherland, especially the sewing of linen and the making of woolen dresses. Internal mothers looked after their own children and other mothers and their children in the lodge, creche, and hospital. If the slave child became sick, the biological mother would be called in and placed in the company hospital with her child. However, the child would have to be seriously sick. According to the complete medical records of the year 1710, 19 slave children were bed patients, yet only one mother, Marguerite, was recalled from her work to look after her children. The company also consulted the internal mothers about conditions in the lodge, which suggests that they had some control over the other female slaves. They did not, however, receive any extra rations. Their continuance through the remainder of the 18th century is dubious. Perhaps they did their job too efficiently and became a nuisance, but this is arguing from silence. We do know that the internal mothers disappear from the sources. The most important aspect of female slave labor in the lodge was that apart from childbearing, the company made little distinction in the type of labor which men and women could do. The company throughout this period had no hesitation in assigning slave women to the most grueling tasks. For example, the company mine at Silver Mine on the road to present-day Komaki, a mine which was worked around the clock, a small undivided hut was set aside for the men and women slaves. It should be remembered that women in contemporary England had proved efficient miners as they could crawl through the narrow coal tunnels, dragging carts with ropes between their legs without encumbrance. The legend in the illustration of this Cape mine shows that the Dutch made a distinction between the maximum number of Europeans, 50, and slaves, 150, who could safely be in the mine at one time, but no mention was made of women, a further hint that no gender difference was shown to company slave women with regard to heavy manual labor. European women, on the other hand, never appear on the company payrolls except as midwives or external mothers. When adventurous individual Dutch women did disguise themselves as men, joined the Dutch East India Company to come to the Cape, and were caught, they were tried and sent home, even though several male settlers instantly asked for their hand in marriage. Settler women at the Cape, like the Virginian counterparts, were supposed to work at the home. It was left to settler and slave women and lodge slave women to work in the field in the ditch. The only evidence of gender differentiation for slave woman of the lodge was that the company did not allow them to work in the company hospital as nurses because of the rough soldiers and sailors who were often afflicted with the venous sickness, venereal disease. Such nursing work as wholly incompatible for a woman, the internal mothers complained on the 10th of February 1710. The political council agreed to use fewer women in the hospital, but the hall, a sermon is preached here every 14 days. 1. Here the evening prayers are read, but not the morning prayers. B. The infirmary or surgery. The mild cases are accustomed upon breaches, but heavily wounded or seriously sick persons lie upon cattles. M. A house for the skafbas, or food inspector of the hospital. N. The dispensary. O. The operating theatre. P. The kitchen and the cook's quarters. Q. The apothecary's dwelling. R. The laboratory. S. The pockage, or ward for venereal diseases. T. The residence of the undersurgeon. U. A door opening on the courtyard. V. The sudatorium, literally sweating box. W. The sub-inspector's quarters. See the picture below. The hospital opposite the lodge. 1. AAA represent the wall around the hospital. Formerly, it was enclosed by a ditch. Only is the main entrance. The main entrance was in the Hereengracht, known as Adderley Street, facing the present Dutch Reformed Church. 2. A side entrance opposite the company's gardens. 3. A back entrance facing the road. 4. The main entrance through the portico in the hall. Above this door is the inscription copied below, page 116. The back exit opposite is also marked. 5. The porter's lodge. 6. An apartment for the bookkeeper. 7. A dark room formerly occupied by the porter. 8. The mortuary. K. Staircase. X. The bell which hangs from a trestle. It is rung at 9 in the morning and at 3 in the afternoon as a signal for meals. It rings again between 9 and 9:30 at night to indicate bedtime. YY. These are palisades in front of the principal's door's house. CC wards. The convalescents and those suffering from minor ailments lie upon benches. Serious cases are arranged in 2 rows upon cattles. DD. These are wards for patients who have been some time in the hospital. They are removed to make room for newcomers in other wards. They are accompanied in the manner aforementioned. E. The residence of the principal doctor who always acts as the chief surgeon. F. The house of the second doctor and undersurgeon. G. A courtyard planted with beautiful and shade-yielding amakwa trees. There are many benches where the convalescent rest and enjoy the fresh air. It is the porter's duty to warn them not to stay out for too long in the open, lest the clean air or the keen air might prove injurious to them at the commencement. Z. Across the wall that partitions a small court from the rest of the grounds. Okay. Okay, so the political council, the formatting of the page is bad. So the political council agreed to use fewer women in the hospital, but did so on epidemiological grounds rather than from notions of gender difference. How the slave women perceived themselves in the hierarchy in the lodge is a difficult question. The detailed crime records rarely provide a glimpse. Attitudes have perforce to be inferred from behavior, reconstructed from the baptismal records, and also deduced from European commentary originating outside the walls of the lodge. If the woman slaves of the settlers had to be coerced to make love to European visitors, this did not apply to the lodge slave woman. Their reputed slave husbands forced them to sleep with visitors, both settlers and the famous Lords of 6 Weeks, the soldiers and sailors who had money and only a short time to spend it. Ambrose Coley, an English visitor in the Cape in 1686, claimed the lodge husbands, quote-unquote, were easily persuaded to pimp their wives. If a slave of the companies should have a mind to have carnal knowledge of one of their women, let him, but give her husband a bit of tobacco roll of about 3 inches long. He will fetch her forthwith to the slave and cause her to lie with him. Menzel, who actually delivered salt to the lodge and was thus one of the few company settlers to pass through the lodge's portals, confirms Cowley's accounts, namely that male slaves actually forced their partners to take a European lover. Elsewhere, he suggests that not all lodge women were loose. Those that were, however, scrupulously insisted on advance payments for their patron. Shame, Chomi, I'm literally recording the video for a second. Yeah, I hope y'all make comments about this. Anyway, comment, like, subscribe so that I can get money hopefully someday from this.
Wait, I thought you posted on YouTube.
Yes, you can get monetized.
No, did you not see the rules that came out yesterday? Oh my word.
Really?
All the big content creators are complaining. Apparently you used to have 10 million views on shorts. Now they've upped it to 20 million.
Yeah, they did the same thing. It used to be 1,500 hours, like just normal view time hours, and for 1,000 subscribers. They lowered subscribers to 500 and up to the watch time to 3,000 hours. So I have 9 hours and 36 subscribers. 37 now that my friend joined. Anyway, you're not here for that. You're here for my reading.
So we put to sleep.
Yeah. Anyway, there was another side to these accounts of the lodge woman. Many travelers and other sources emphasized that lodge slave women willingly courted European sexual attention. For instance, according to the genuinely pained political council members in 1681, the slave women in the lodge flaunted their European lovers in public, dancing stark naked even on Sundays in full aspect. Charles Lockyer, who visited the Cape in 1711, claimed that there is little notice taken of the sailors who lodge in their rooms. As far for the women themselves, they are so fond of white children that they would willingly have no other, whence the breed is highly improved, many of them being as white as Europeans.
They say breed. I just hear the word breed. Okay.
This is a reading that takes direct quotes. A lot of the readings I read have Negro, a lot of them have breed, a lot of them have blacks. Unfortunately, these are readings that quote from the 17, 16, 1400s. So yeah. Anyway.
Try to hold it back. You've taken my earrings off.
Ne. John Daniel Boutner, a doctor who stayed at the Cape in the 1720s, also remarked on the mixed-race children in the lodge, the result of willing miscegenation from men of many nations. The most compelling evidence comes from the church records. The independent church archives reveal that company slave women took great pains to drive a genealogical stake into the baptismal records of the colony, always naming their invariably absent European lover as the father by providing an exact patronym. Whether the slave women were coerced by their slave spouses or were willing partners, the result was the same, what Menzel termed an entire mestiço class in the lodge. Obviously, I think Spanish. See, I can't pronounce the C. I'm going to try again. Mestizo class in the lodge, because it looks like Mozambique. It has the same C when people say Mozambique. So I'm going to say mestizo class in the lodge. Where the slave woman of the lodge being defiant of the growing racial order by flaunting their European partners, or simply establishing for their offspring the best possible chance in a colony where the advantages depended so clearly on a light skin color. If slavery became increasingly racially based in the colony, then the genius of the lodge woman lay in their success in making that association as difficult and troublesome as possible for the ruling order, and by flaunting European fatherhood, they also put their pimping slave spouses in their places. Conclusions. Emerging racial descent criteria came to override long-established patterns of European gender deference in the lodge. No European woman worked at heavy manual labor, while all lodge women were used in the heaviest work, including mining. Further, it was more important in the lodge that the mestizo be mestizo than female, at least as far as the allocation of easier tasks and the granting of freedom were concerned. But lodge women used the system to acquire the best life chances for their offspring and themselves. So there are going to be pictures of this, but there's also the artifact found in recent excavations in the lodge by archaeologist Dr. Gabieba Abraham Willis, showing a European woman carrying a yoke, the symbol of work. Perhaps this was an exemplary icon exhorting the slave lodge woman that they had to work. This has become known as the Painted Lady. This segment is like to say their names, so I'm just going to run through the names of people. I didn't want to leave this out. Petronella Lammerts, born circa 1688. Petronella is listed in the 1693 slave census as a full breed school child of unknown origin. She would therefore have been between 4 and 13 years old in 1693, and it is likely she was born around 1688 as her first child was baptized in 1708. The baptismal register for 1708 lists her as Petronella Lammerts. In later references, Lammerts is sometimes recorded as Lambertse or Lambertses. B1. Flora, born 1708 in Cape Town, baptized 16 September 1708 in Cape Town, manumitted by Cornelius de Vries van Leeuwarden in 1737, married Cornelius de Vries, date unknown. Flora manumitted a woman named Eva, no relationship to Flora listed, in 1742. C1. Hermanus, born in 1728 in Cape Town, baptized 1st August 1728 in Cape Town, possibly manumitted in 1749, and there's a question mark. There was one male named Hermanus listed as manumitted from the lodge in 1749, but there is no way of discerning whether or not he was Flora's child. No matronym was mentioned. C2. Christina, birth date unknown, married Jan Joost Steenberg or Johan Joost Steenberg, born 14 May 1723, 3rd October 1751, de Villiers Bama. Flora Wilhelmina, baptized 18 June 1752. D2. Katharina, baptized 20 January 1754, married Peter Langnau van Danzig, a boatswain, 16 September 1770. Permission to repatriate, 5 March 1786. Eva, birth date unknown. So C3, Eva, birth date unknown, married Jan Rudolf. Hamburg, 4 June 1752. D1. Johannes Hendrik, birth date unknown, baptized 22nd April 1753. D2. Francina Elizabeth, birth date unknown, baptized 4 January 1761, married Johann Jacob Cuba van Danzig, 7 April 1782. E1. Elizabeth Louisa Dorothea, birth date unknown, baptized 12 March 1780. E2. Johann Rudolf, birth date unknown, married Elizabeth Katerina Bakker or Baker, 16 May 1802. Gosh, there's a lot. Jesus. E3. Johann Frederick Ephraim, birth date unknown, baptized 1786. E4. Cornelia Maria Christina, birth date unknown, baptized 1788. E5. Jacob George Daniel, birth date unknown, baptized 1791. E6. Elizabeth Francina, birth date unknown, baptized 1793. D3. Johannes Christoffel, birth date unknown, baptized 19 June 1763. Johannes Rudolf, birth date unknown, baptized 13 October 1765. B2. Jacoba van Petronella, born 1713 in Cape Town, baptized 8 January 1713 in Cape Town. Hendrina, born 1729 in Cape Town, baptized 9 October 1729 in Cape Town. C2, Elizabeth van Jacoba, born in Cape Town, baptized in Cape Town. D1, Annelies van Elizabeth van der Kaap, born 1768 or 1769, as Annelies was manumitted and adopted on the 2nd of January 1776 when she was 7 years old by Jan Michael Grenier van Krumbach. She would have been born in 1768 or 1769. Married, 1. Karl Friedrich Wagner, 13 September 1818, 2. Hendrik Dietrich van Hesse-Kassel after 1818. Jessie or Gesje, born 1778, May, in Cape Town, baptized in Cape Town, as Gessie was manumitted and adopted on 16 February 1779 when she was 9 months old by Gerhard Meyer von Stade. She was probably born in May 1778. Jürgen, born 1767 and 1769, sometime between there. Sometime between 1768 and 1770, Johann Jörg Renner requested the manumission of Jürgen, son of Elizabeth Jacoba Patronella of the Cape, 18 months old. Jürgen would therefore have been born between 1767 and 1769. And B3, finally, Christian, born 1717 in Cape Town, baptized 11 July 1717 in Cape Town. We say their names to try and respect their legacies and also to really just try and emphasize the examples of how these records were traced. You don't have to learn those things, I don't think. They're not going to be tested.